And once again, thank you to Permer for sponsoring this evening's webinar. We truly appreciate it. And we're also partnering this evening with Syntax is going to be presenting this evening. And we are delighted and thrilled to be joined by the CEO from Syntax. And Ms. Corinne Morton is a seasoned professional with over 22 years experience in the field of education and communications. In January 2017, there she is up on the box there now, she took the role of co-owner and subsequently became the CEO of Syntax, a position in which she has played an integral role in the company's development and evolution. As CEO, Corinne assumes a multifaceted role, overseeing a team of account directors and managing the entire spectrum of company personnel. Her responsibilities extend to heading the oversight of services to school district clients, where she places a strong emphasis on fostering effective communication at every level of service. Corinne's expertise shines particularly during high-level crises, where she offers invaluable guidance to clients in need and instructs staff on adeptly managing the complex issue that school districts may encounter. Drawing from her extensive experience in the K-12 arena, Corinne brings innovation and a fresh perspective to all aspects of her clients' communications needs, whether it's providing strategic consulting to school administration, skillfully crafting messaging for our community, or advising on comprehensive bond information campaigns. She consistently delivers exceptional results, and Corinne is a proud graduate of Briarcliff College and also a Sachem alumni that we know as well. And her dedication to enhancing communication within the education sector continues to make a significant impact on Syntax and its clients. And Corinne, welcome to the Nassau-Suffolk School Board Association's webinar this evening. We appreciate partnering with you and, more importantly, gaining some insight based on your years of experience and your expertise. So welcome, and I hope folks hear what you have to say, and we're going to invite folks to ask questions, put questions in the chat box, if you will, or the Q&A box, actually, and we'll try to monitor them and give those questions to Corinne as she does the presentation as we go along. We don't want you to just sit there and try to think of something at the very end, but there'll be time at the end, too, if we haven't answered your question. So we invite you to put in your questions again into the Q&A. And once again, Corinne, it's all yours. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. So thank you for, having me here today, or tonight, I should say, while it's still light outside for now. We're really going to cover a wide basis here, talking about crisis communications. But, we'll drill down on some of the most important parts, some of the things you really need to pay attention to. And you can go to the next slide. So throughout this presentation, we're really going to cover, truthfully, these three main components here. We're going to have an understanding of what really constitutes as a crisis. And these are not your everyday threats that are coming in. These are legitimate things where we need to have all boots on the ground. Everybody needs to be, designated to be doing something for, dealing with the issue at hand. So there really needs to be a clear understanding between what is truly a crisis and what is just something that's a heightened communications issue at the time, or just something that, really is just something that we have to manage on a lower level, although even those might seem like crisis at the moment. We're going to go through a couple of the goals, things that we need to keep in mind as we go through that process, as we kind of understand what we're doing, what we need to respond to, what kind of messaging is necessary, and then some of the challenges that we face as we go through those. What are most often it's community panic. Those are the types of things that sort of drive some of our, decisions, or some of what we're looking at, as well as, media, and their influence and their need for information as well. So you can move on to the next one. But really first, before we can get into any of this, one of the main factors, or one of the main drivers, is building trust within our community. And that starts from the very beginning. That starts well before a crisis even hits. That's something that we need to be building upon our, initial tenure, whether you're a board member, whether you're a superintendent, whether you're an administrator, a principal. That trust needs to be built from the beginning. And without that, it it really is very hard to effectively manage and deal with a crisis. That's not to say that when you come into a new tenure that, something could happen ultimately right away, which is understandable. But as you're sort of moving through and as you're sort of, learning your community and building those relationships, it is really important to first build that trust with your community, your stakeholders, and your faculty and staff. Next. And some of the ways that we look to build build that trust within our buildings, within our community, and the key word of transportation, sorry, not transportation, transparency is one of those words that I think gets thrown around a lot. But think about the fact that, when we're not communicating effectively, or we're not giving all of the information that we possibly can, that's when your community or your stakeholders or others build their own narrative. So it is very important to really, try to imagine all those things that they would want to be, sort of open to and understanding of to the best of our abilities. A lot of times, trying to build some kind of community engagement, things where, they maybe are coming in for things, or you're hosting events or hosting things. You want to have a visibility in your leadership, which maybe is just through events that you're having, meeting your stakeholders. One of the things that I think happens a lot too is you have maybe pockets or groups where they maybe have certain feelings or have certain thoughts about the way things are going or the way things could be going, opinions. And one of the best ways to sort of establish, whether it's going to be a belief of, your way and our way, but at least having them in and sometimes having an actual conversation with those groups or a key member from that group really does sort of help in the building of trust and sort of, giving them that information that sort of will help. Because when the tragedy actually happens, if we don't have some of that pre-established communication or that pre-established relationships, it's very hard to build upon that or to have people trust that what you're saying is entirely accurate or is the best of what you can give them, or anything in that case. So it really is very important to pay a lot of attention to that and build that trust before we actually step into a crisis, and we actually have to manage through that.
So it's a year-round effort, right? Don't wait until the crisis comes into play. Know who your stakeholders are, get to know what their priorities are, but establish a pattern of the communication, who it's coming from, so that it's familiar to the receiving end. And then this way, when something does happen and you have to get information out quickly, you've established that trust, that credibility, and people will know to rely on that source of information. And you are crafting your message based on the stakeholder group. Because you said something interesting earlier on too, right? You have your community stakeholder group, but you also have your employee stakeholder group too, which is just as important to communicate to both. It could be different messages, but those are two very important stakeholder groups, especially during a crisis, correct?
They are, and your faculty and staff are really your first line, right? Those are the people who have the most engagement with your parents. They are, the parents send their kids to school every day. I'm a parent myself. I have 2 boys, and you send them to school, and you hope that they will be just fine. They're going to go to school. They're going to have a great day, and they're going to come home. And your faculty and staff is really your first line of people that parents are going to connect with. Obviously, when we're dealing with a major crisis, those are the outlet of information is going to be a little different. But on some levels, depending on where the situation has happened, it could be your principal that's your first line of defense. It could be in a classroom. You never know. So you really want to make sure that you're building that sort of level of trust and information with those key groups to the best of your abilities. So as we begin to sort of look at how we're going to plan for a crisis, right? The most important thing to remember is that as much as we want to plan to have everything go exactly as we wish, know that during a crisis that hardly ever happens. But having something that you can call upon that is giving you that guide when everything is thrown in the air is the most important thing that you can call upon when this is happening. Creating that crisis management plan is effective. You're going to have who is going to be your point person, who is going to be the person who will be speaking, who is your second person who is going to be speaking. You as the superintendent, maybe the person who has, the most knowledge is the person that's going to be out in front of the cameras if that's necessary, the person who is going to develop statements and things like that. However, what if the superintendent is involved? What if the superintendent is not able to do that? Is there a board member who would take that place? Is there another member of your administration that's going to take that place? So you have to sort of account for different scenarios, and what might happen under certain circumstances. As you may or may not know, we deal with a lot of school districts. That's basically 99% of our clientele. So we have a vast awareness of all the different things that maybe a school district is going to need, just having dealt with, various and some very, heavy crisis and issues over the years. Even during my time, I've been there for 21 years. So, as much as we want to plan, we have to also understand that there's going to be variations to those plans, but we're going to call upon those, and they're going to be important as a guide for us moving forward. But one of the things people always ask for is, well, can't you just give us a booklet of every scenario that could ever happen? And the answer is absolutely not. And that's because really, truthfully, at the end of the day, nothing ever happens. And really dealing with about 82 school districts, I could have the same issue and nothing ever happens the same way twice. So there really is no, and that kind of goes back to, preparing for all scenarios. It's hard to be so linear in what you're going to do or how you're going to do it. But, creating that awareness, I think, is most poignant.
And interesting point as far as who should be speaking, right? It could depend on the situation. Like sometimes, depending on the situation, you want the superintendent front and center, right? Depending on another situation, it could be the spokesperson for the district. It might be somebody from your firm that is speaking on behalf. But if you do have somebody who is speaking before the media or communicating, they also should have the skill set. Just because they have the title doesn't mean you want to put them out in front of the camera speaking, because if they can't present well, they can't communicate well. You want to make sure, particularly during a crisis situation, you have somebody who has the skill set on how to communicate the message, stay on message, maybe field questions or whatever, but it's presenting that credibility, that trust, that authoritative persona, if you will. Just because you're president of the board doesn't mean you should be stepping in front of a microphone. And this is something that the governance team as a whole, the board and the superintendent, should discuss way ahead of time how things are handled, correct?
Correct. And that's, really honestly, every situation is going to dictate exactly how that's going to go. Obviously in most cases it is your superintendent, but like you said, Bob, it's not always the person who is going to be, again, they might be in the situation themselves and they can't. So you do have to have, some awareness of kind of whatever the situation might be, but also, what is your order? Also developing, if you go back one, just, sort of developing that relationship with your local, I kind of skipped over it even though it's there, but it is very important to have those relationships prior, right? When we have to call upon them, and I think now with safety and, all that being a very high priority, there is probably no district that doesn't have a direct line of communication with their local law enforcement, but maintaining that, right? It's not just about the regular things that you're doing, but how do we sort of build that from where it might be to make that even better? Do we have, regular meetings with them? Do we invite them in? You have a good contact with your SRO. How does that line up with other districts? It's something that you really do want to, have a really good understanding together with them, because more than likely the crisis that we're discussing today is something where they're going to be the first people responding to something of this nature. So you really do need to make sure that there is a really broad awareness there from the school district's point and also from your local law enforcement.
And when you're dealing with law enforcement and matters of a crisis that could be legal in nature, it's really important to communicate and coordinate with them as far as messaging, because you certainly don't want to get ahead of them and what they're trying to communicate, correct?
Correct. And actually, that's a really good point, because there are certain times where we may not be able to say much until, police really release further information, or there's some kind of information that we might be releasing, but we have to wait for them to vet. So there is 100% a very big need to make sure that you have that, as you're working through things, because if you do something out of turn or out of step, that's really going to affect, how the crisis might be handled, how you might be sort of dealing with that more so in the future. It's more about when we get to the end of this, where we're talking about the recovery. So that is a very good point.
Okay.
And some of the components that we are, looking at in terms of, what would be included in our crisis communication plan, what's our purpose, who's our team. I think a lot of this stuff we've, sort of run through in our previous slide, but also your key audiences. What does that look like? Does certain scenarios call for different, audience? Do we tailor things more so for certain audiences versus others? Do we have, things where, maybe it's something that really is only pertaining to the students in our building, so we're really stressed on getting to our parents first versus it being more of a community-wide issue? Where does that, and who does that affect? Because there are certain things that have happened, where it's really more of a community-wide crisis, versus maybe just something that we need to handle within our own parent community before we go broader. Of course, with social media, as we'll get to in a later slide, that does sort of the lines get blurred quite often. But sort of also, as we touched upon, procedures of information, your verification, your release of information, those are really important, because you can't really recall anything that you put out there anymore. Once it's out there, it's widely spread. So, you really have to be somewhat careful with that information that you're putting out there, and understanding that more often than not, depending on which building something is happening in, if it is something that's happening inside of a building, your parents are going to know before you can even prepare and put something out, because every child, almost every child, has a cell phone.
And that's an important point too, right? Sometimes there's a sense of urgency to get information out, but I would always remind my board members during certain situations, it's more important to get the information out correctly rather than quickly. Because like you said, once it's out there, if there's a mistake, then we're going to have a problem.
Absolutely.
And I know somebody has raised their hand. Again, if you can, there should be a Q&A box up at the top. Put your question into the Q&A, and we'll try to address your question. So there we go. Keep going, Corinne.
And so when I had done a presentation years ago, and I spoke after one of the mothers that had lost her child in Sandy Hook, and probably one of the most, a very difficult presentation to follow, and have to give my presentation on, communicating and dealing with a crisis. But one of the biggest things that stuck with me that she had said was really about the reunification process, right? And something that we don't truly think about, because many school districts here don't necessarily have to deal with that too often. But what does reunification look like? And, when we're talking about training and drills, it is really one of the most important things. And what she had explained to the crowd, which was probably upwards of about 200 people, was that basically there was a reunification center, and everybody was to report there. And basically the only parents were left whose parents, were children who were not coming home. And, to have to sort of understand that, and again, I don't know that you can really rethink it and handle it a different way, maybe, but, that was one of the most important things I think that stuck with me, because as they're looking around, and as, each child is being brought to their respective parents, what does a reunification process look like, and how do you execute that? And once all those people in the room realize, hold on, our kids aren't coming out, how do we deal with that? What are the ways in which we maybe can eliminate that sort of feeling, or that sort of, maybe sort of where these people feel a certain way and have watched all the others, reunify. So, in talking of training and drills, I don't know that that's an easy one to sort of train for, but it's something to at least give thought to, if that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, and Tom Cooley was like, vetting communication before actually communicating, right? What may sound good in the moment is probably sometimes could send you sideways. And again, that nightmare scenario of Sandy Hook, I don't know how you would handle that better, or I can't even imagine. But after every crisis, there's always a debrief and lessons learned. And again, getting back to your crisis team, it's not just your communications people. But hopefully you have social workers on hand and ready to deal with any trauma and things that folks are dealing with. These are all things that it's important to establish those teams and have tabletop exercises and work through and try to think of everything and look at lessons in the past, right?
Yeah. We can move on. So really, in talking about what are those things that we want to try and put out there, as quickly as we can, but as accurate as we can, and understanding that we're never going to beat the child with the cell phone that can get to their parent, and their parent can get to social media before anything that we can ever put out. So as Bob said before, it is best to be as accurate as possible, as quick as possible, but don't trump accuracy for speed, because you will have to do a lot of cleanup after. You will have cleanup after no matter what, but always try and make sure that the information you're putting out there is as accurate as possible. And so
it's incredibly important that the governance team is extremely disciplined in this situation, right? Because board members are going to be bombarded, just like the school district will be bombarded, and board members have to be disciplined to say, we have a process in place for communications. As much as I would like to share information or whatever, you can't open up that Pandora's box if it's outside the protocol, particularly during a crisis situation. Allow the process to work, and don't go off on your own trying to, under the guise of helping and trying to communicate information. Allow the process and the protocol to go forward with it.
Absolutely. And that goes for not only board members, but your, members of your cabinet, for your principals, for your teachers, for your other staff members. They have to have an understanding that, because what happens is one bit of information snowballs and sort of turns into, this mess of information that you can't really clean up after it's gone out too far. Mm-hmm. So, you really want to make sure that everybody understands that when we're talking about a very serious crisis that's happening, the funnel of information is coming from one spot. And that is a designated spot. That is not from 5 different people. Well, so-and-so told me, okay, well, that's what gets us in trouble. Because when so-and-so says this versus so-and-so says that, now we're having a mix of information. And remember, anything that we put out and anything that we're going to say is all going to be put up on social media. So we always have to have that kind of in the back of our mind and be thinking about that. Because that's really where news outlets might grab their information from. It's less likely that people are going to go to your website first. They're going to probably go to your social media. And again, we'll kind of glance at social media as we move along. But these are key points that we can try and include in our initial message. If we say we're going to update you, you better believe we should have an update ready. At some point. And even if that update is just to say, we don't have an update right now, but we will, that's better than nothing. That's better than leaving people hanging, because they're sort of, especially when this is involving children, right? You have their precious cargo. So they all they want to know is that their kids are safe. So really, if you're alerting them that you're going to be updating, with information, but you don't really have anything to update, then let them know that. Let them know that at this time we don't have any further information, but we will, update you again as that becomes more clear. And that kind of goes with our when will you know more, or when will you tell us more? Those are, key points, because I think those are things that people forget. You sort of say, we'll fill you in, and then you sort of move on, because things are moving at a pace that's, almost something you can't really keep up with. But you really need to stay on point with that.
Right. So if you say we're going to provide an update in 30 minutes, don't allow 45 minutes to go by without any communication whatsoever, even if it's 30 minutes saying, hey, nothing new is developed. We'll be back again 20 minutes from now, whatever it is, because people are relying on that timely information.
Correct. So, again, I think this sort of ties into the previous slide, but, we want to have as clear and concise messaging as possible. And that's really important in terms of, when we get more towards the media, right? So you're going to have, in a situation where we have a major crisis, you're going to have media outlets reaching from all aspects. It could be way bigger than you've ever had, in terms of people trying to contact you or trying to get information from you. You're going to want to make sure that whatever message is going out is the same for all. Because when you have one getting something different versus someone else, you sort of set this uneven, release of information. And, it tends to be, especially with a true crisis like this, can be a little imbalanced, and maybe sort of different media outlets are reporting something different than others. So your best bet is to make sure that you have a very clear and concise message, and whatever you're sending out is being sent out to all, or to all that are asking.
And sometimes it's important to build those relationships with your local media outlets too, so they know you and they know who the person is. Again, getting back credibility and trust. Another stakeholder group are the reporters or are the media outlets that cover your school. It could be local papers, it could be Newsday, it could be News 12. There should be relationships established there so they have a credible source to go to as well.
Correct. That's always an important thing that you should be building, again, a year-round thing that you should sort of be building with them. But when we're talking about a crisis that's this large, usually we're having, media outlets that either you've never spoken with before, you have no idea who they are, you've never dealt with those reporters before. And what can easily happen is, well, I deal with Newsday all the time, so I'll give them special attention, and I won't really turn my attention to NBC or ABC or, Fox or whatever other, the New York Times. However, when you start to do that, you're sort of almost limiting your credibility, and your awareness level. So you have to be a little careful in that regard. But yes, as far as your local news, or your Newsdays, News 12s, those ones that you would really be reaching out to all the time, building those relationships with them, because they may be the people who are going to be there post-crisis, right? Your other outlets are just reporting on some major news event that's happening, but your more local news is going to be reporting throughout the entire process and beyond. So, you definitely want to maintain those relationships, but keep that credibility with all of those news outlets, but have that understanding that your more local ones are going to be the ones who are going to continue that reporting. And then, I think we do have a slide for media, so I won't really go on that one yet, but having that, centralized information where, again, there's one spot where this information is coming out of, because when you have, all of these different areas, you'll run into, very serious issues. And like Bob said, your board members are really going to be the ones that are probably most pestered or pressured for additional info. You are the ones that are out in the community. You're the ones that people might have your personal cell phone. You're the ones that have friends that are, at the food store, see you all around. So they're going to come to you, and you have to have that dedication, or that, ability
Discipline.
to say to them, discipline is the word I was looking for, that discipline to really say, we have to follow certain protocols. So, you just kind of think about those things, because they really are things that will happen that you really will kind of glance over at the time, but you actually need to really pay, a good bit of attention to those kinds of things. And really for, your administration team to also have that awareness for a board, that your board is really the people who are going to be probably the first line of people who are being pestered for some kind of information or extra information or private or privileged information.
Yeah, as an example, we had a board member who worked in town in a very visible public spot. So we always looped that board member in very quickly because we knew people would be going to his store and saying, hey, and you never wanted them to be blindsided too. So
Right.
protocol will depend on visibility as well.
Right. We can go to the next one. So this is just, giving us a little bit of an understanding of maybe what we would deal with or what our needs would be during a crisis. Obviously, if you have, a communications team, a communications company, you have an internal person, however that goes, they have to be part of this process, because they are the people who are going to help sort of manage and facilitate a lot of those media inquiries, a lot of the questions that are coming in, drafting those messages or statements or letters or whatever the needs are. So, and obviously you're going to coordinate with your law enforcement, because those are likely, for a crisis that we're talking about, going to be your first line of people who are going to show up. Again, managing, your students and staff, their needs. Likely we're talking about things or something that's happening inside of a building. Those are typically these kinds of events that we're discussing. So how are we ensuring the safety and security of our staff and students? We do all these drills all the time. This is when we're going to put those into play and see how well those practices have, can be implemented. You're going to, obviously, we've discussed having your communications plan and implementing that. The things when we get to sort of, press conferences and things like that, we don't, generally speaking, even in a lot of the scenarios we've dealt with, we haven't had a lot of those. They tend to be somewhat all over the place. You really have to be very disciplined when dealing with those. A lot of times, they're on school grounds, so you have that to deal with. We have had a couple, but it's generally been quite a few years before we've really had to think about putting up a press conference. So I think that those are sort of something that if there's no real need, then we don't really need to sort of put that into play, but, have some understanding that could be a possibility. We've, had one that was dealing with a student who passed, a very prominent passing, and really the most effective way to reach all media outlets at the same time for the manner in which the student passed was a press conference. So they do happen, but a lot less likely, I think, now than they probably were in years past.
And sometimes law enforcement may be holding the press conference and inviting a spokesperson from the school district to join their press conference, but that's part of their protocol. Don't crash the party unless you're invited, right?
Correct. And I have to say that it's probably that way that happens more often than the school district actually hosting their own. And, as we know, required by law, maintaining that safety, the confidentiality of any student or staff that may be sort of impacted by this. A lot of times that information may come from your law enforcement. So you may be withholding that, but once names and information are released, it's very hard to, at that point, if your law enforcement is releasing that info, we're going to follow that guidance.
Right. You haven't violated the confidentiality if they put it out there.
Correct. And so to go on a little further about, dealing with the news, it's probably almost going to be the one thing that makes the whole process somewhat most chaotic, because I don't think anyone can truly understand the nature with which the media comes at you for a true crisis. when these things are happening, and the impact that that can have on any one individual when you have all of these different media outlets reaching out to you. And we could be talking upwards of 20, 30 just questions and emails and calls, and they can get their hands on numbers and information like no other. So we have to have some sort of realization that that's going to happen. And as much as we could be irked by that or be feel pestered, you have to really step back and remember they're doing what their job is, right? And their job is to alert the community or their readership of a situation that's unfolding. And you have to have that sort of understanding in order to be able to handle the news media in general. And if you don't, it's going to be very hard to sort of get through that without having that broader understanding. They're gonna need that information as quickly as possible. Likely it's going to be quick shot reporting, breaking news, very minimal information in a story. They're just looking to get that out there. They're looking for the news splash. They're looking for the clicks. They're looking for whatever it is. But they can also be your biggest help in alerting broader members of even a surrounding community of something that's happening in your community, because we're not far from one another here. So what could happen in one district is going to likely impact on some level a surrounding district. So they can be to work to your advantage for something like that, or even just again, that broader awareness.
And they could dispel some of the myths that may be percolating or running viral on social media too. It could help try to quell some of that if you're giving them the factual information to report as well.
Correct. And more often than not, they are going to be coming to the school or the district office or anywhere that they think that they need to be. So you need to have your security team very well aware. And likely, depending on the crisis, you could have some of your security team dealing with said crisis. So you need to make sure that whomever you can have on hand is going to sort of have the media realize where their boundaries are in terms of where they can be and can't be on campus. If you're doing a press conference, that's different. You're going to create a designated area. You're going to give them a space to work from. You're going to have a lot more control over that when we're dealing with just them reporting to the school and trying to either get people who are walking by or students that are coming out or parents that are walking by. There is a limitation for where they can report from, and your staff needs to be understanding of that as well. Where can they stand that's within the distance that they're allowed, but also not impact whatever's happening at the school or at the district office or wherever, and that they're at a safe distance from what is legally allowed.
And that's a good point too regarding board members, right? Maybe you're at work, maybe you're at home, and crisis is unfolding as a board member. Your first inclination or first desire may be to run up to the school and be there for support. It's probably best just to sit back at home. The last thing they need is a couple additional people running around the campus or the buildings and having to worry about where you're at too, right?
Correct. I think that kind of segues perfectly into, this slide where, one of and how well we dictate our emotions during a crisis is going to dictate the people around us. The best thing we can do is be as calm and cool and collective as we can be. And I know that is way easier said than done during a crisis like this. But however you are and however you act is going to impact and sort of spill out to everybody below you or working with you or handling the crisis with you. So really, you have to be able to navigate your own emotions before we can really handle or help with anyone else's. We need to have a very careful understanding of also those impacted. Parents' emotions, children's emotions, staff emotions, board members, anybody, who this does directly impact is going to feel a very heightened sense when we're dealing with something of this nature. So you have to have that broader awareness of managing that and navigating those. And it's going to kind of just go like this. You're going to feel like you have it all together, and then all of a sudden something else gets thrown at you, and you're going to go on this roller coaster. And unless you can sort of figure out how best to keep yourself in a calmer state as best you can, that's only going to help in these situations. And I think, just some people are for surely more apt to be able to do that than others. But it's, a key element in sort of dealing with and managing through some of these things that, you could encounter when we're dealing with a crisis of this level. And so, what does that really look like? As I said, remaining calm and, being very understanding, I think, or that empathy, if you will, with the way others might be feeling. When you're contacting the proper law enforcement, school officials, I think we kind of went over a lot of this information in our previous slide as we were talking, but, I think in terms of that, you're dealing with all of those heightened senses. So you're sort of trying to figure out what's the best way to navigate some of those things, with also understanding there are people who are going to feel a certain way. And I think most often the people who are going to be the most heightened are, one, the people who are dealing with this, in whatever capacity they're dealing with it, and then your parent population, if this is affecting students specifically. So again, I think one of the bigger things where, we can, as humans, if you will, have the biggest trouble with is sort of acknowledging those emotions, right? You just kind of want to go, yeah, let's move on, let's do this, let's do that. And you don't really stop and understand that there are those feelings that people are going to have to navigate through. There is, maybe someone on this side who is completely having a breakdown, and then someone on this one who is just, okay, that's fine, we're going to move on. So you have to kind of be able to play both sides and be that reason in the middle that sort of keeps the ship sailing and keeps things together. You need to be able to empathize with those around you, again, and being supportive and non-judgmental, right? You might think, yeah, this is just something we're dealing with at the time, we're going to get through this, it's not a big deal. But to somebody else, this is a very big deal. And this is something that, that person maybe is having a very tough time, and your judgment on them maybe, sort of resonates and you don't even realize that. Sorry. One of the things too, I think the last bullet about avoidance and intense emotion is probably the bigger thing in all of this, right? Our default is to sort of just avoid some of the matters at hand, and not because we're willingly making that choice, but because that's the easier way to handle things, right? We just kind of throw everybody to the side and say, well, I'm just going to do this how I want to do it, in this manner, in this way, and we avoid all of those other things that are happening around us. We're actually really doing ourselves a big disservice. Also, on the flip side of that is that intense emotion, where people are unable to be rational in what they're doing and almost go to the complete opposite of the avoidance and become so completely emotional about it when they are the people who are supposed to really be our level heads, right, throughout a crisis.
Really is a fine balance during a very tough time.
It really truly is. And I mean, I can sit here and say, you should do this and this and this, and no one is going to know or be able to effectively prepare for these types of things until you're in it. And so really what we're trying to do here is just give you things to think about and give you things to sort of, as you're developing some of this, think through. But, we will always have these external influences as we go through these things, whatever those may be. Oftentimes, a lot of it is social media, because let's face it, that's the world today, right? That's where your information is really released at, whether it's by your parents, by whatever groups. So, the impact of social media on any crisis is pretty high. Most likely your parents are going to visit that before they visit anything else. They're not really probably going to go to your website, because that's where the chatter is. That's where your mom's groups are. Traditionally, it's Facebook. I have a few, sort of research to kind of go over where people might be going.
Oh, they're
But
going to those community groups on Facebook because the community groups always know first.
and very
If
true.
if there's a helicopter in the air, there's a person from the community group
There
in the helicopter knowing what's happening.
definitely someone's going to know why that helicopter is circulating. But again, it's also the release of the information inside of that, right? So there are definitely times where we may make a decision to only release something on the district's website or only release something on social media. There are valid reasons why we may decide to put something in one spot or another. But when we're dealing with something that's this broad and something that we're, on this level, you're going to want to put that everywhere. And part of that too is the allowance for people to then share inside of your page to their pages. We cannot control what is said on their pages once it's shared, but we can at least see, one, who shared it and where it's being shared to. And we can kind of follow along with, again, that monitoring of public sentiment. If there's somebody on the team who can be monitoring what's being asked, what questions, things that we're seeing that are constantly being asked, we're not really answering that question. We can answer questions without really answering questions. Even
And
by
it could help
acknowledging.
develop your FAQ for afterwards too.
Correct. And always know that anything you're sharing out with your public or your parents or it's public information. So to try and withhold that is really silly on your part. Once it's out there and it's shared, it's public info. So really at the end of the day, trying to hold that as like, well, no, this is my message only for parents. It's going to get out there in one way or another. It's going to make
So
its way.
so envision it as a headline.
Correct. And so, as I was saying before, YouTube obviously isn't really something we're going to use for this nature, but Facebook is still in the top and this is, done by Pew Research Center. So a lot of these stats that we're going to look at in the next few slides are just to give us a guide for probably what we already know, is that Facebook tends to still be one of the top used social media outlets. And I think it really kind of depends on ages. So Instagram is really where you're going to find your younger parents and or your high school kids, maybe your middle school kids. But Facebook still to this day, even though it's probably not used in the same capacity as it was, if you ask any general parent what they're still using to look for district information or moms, there's no moms groups inside of Instagram. So that is kind of keeps that Facebook alive and to the top of why we still need to pay as much attention to that as we still do. Some of these really aren't relevant to school districts. Again, YouTube, unless maybe you're putting together a video regarding, whatever situation, maybe you're recording yourself and you're going to I think in the heightened sense of a crisis, you're not really doing that. It's easier to get words out than it is to really put a video together and post it. So, you're really looking at Facebook, Instagram. I don't really think many districts are using TikTok. So, those are your top two, and or I guess X.
So it's not just being a boomer still using Facebook, as my adult children like to remind me of. So it's statistically, it's where people are going because of those groups, as you mentioned.
It is. And I mean, I don't know that they're sort of coordinated, but for us and our purposes, yes, Facebook is generally, and you can kind of see here, it's just it's just a solid outlier in the amount of people that use it. But I think to this day, a lot of people would say, well, I would get rid of Facebook if I didn't have to go there for my school information, my mom's pages, my this or that. So I think they're using it not in the same capacity that they were, but they're using it for the kinds of things that they were using it for to get that information. And otherwise, if they didn't need that there, then they would abandon it altogether. But a lot of the other ones are really sort of, interchangeable when we get down to Pinterest. It's really Instagram and Facebook that are
So
the out.
here's an interesting question and a strategy point that was made. How do you manage misinformation on social media without engaging in a conversation that could easily become heated? And somebody suggested you join the pages as maybe an alias and you monitor what's going on. So again, you can almost craft your message to dispel some of the myths. I think that's kind of an interesting point. What's your take on how to handle the misinformation and how to properly monitor pages without tipping your hand, so to speak?
You could. I mean, I think, if we're talking about just on the regular, yeah, I mean, that's beneficial. I think that becomes somewhat cumbersome to try and figure out every mom's page and every group. I think that to dispel every rumor that comes around is probably extremely difficult. People are going to talk. Keyboard warriors are very strong. Um, if you're really finding that it's a rumor that needs to be dispelled, I would honestly take that back to your page and put that, if there's something that's really miscommunicated or misunderstood, then properly explain that on your page and let them go share that out. Because engaging with them on that platform as an alias, if they figure that out, I don't know, you kind of run the risk. Can be done, I'm sure. I'm sure there are many people that do it. But to me, I feel like if there's really something that truly needs to be dispelled in terms of a rumor, then it's best to sort of take that back to your page where you control the narrative, where you control what's being released, where you control the information. It leaves you to at least have more of the upper hand.
Right.
When
Monitor it to help craft your future messaging.
Correct.
If
And so
possible.
maybe there is something that's coming up repeatedly that we would want to include in our future messaging when we're talking about real serious crisis and issue management. There's nobody that's going to have time to go review what certain moms pages are saying or what they might be making up. You're going to do the best you can with the information you have at hand.
Yeah, this could be a strategy for like the cleanup afterwards or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Because there's always going to be, talk or this or that, or I don't understand why this didn't happen or why this information didn't get released. And there are, times where we've gone through that and actually, said, yes, we understand that you want more information, but understand as well, there's a limit to what we can, put out there. So it can dictate some of our follow-up communications.
Right. And somebody followed up and said you could also join as the district official social media account. So this way you're getting out to other channels as opposed to just your own, that could be part of your broadcast network. And it's the official source if it says, ABC school district says, boom, it's just another channel to get communication out in a massive way, in a timely way. So that's a good point too.
Right. And again, I think this just kind of gives that sort of age range, and who is really looking or using each social media platform. And then, I thought this one was kind of interesting to include because people actually don't want to go to social media to consume accurate news, I guess, if you will, but more so because it's convenient to them, right? We talk about the push out of information or the having to retrieve it. Social media is put together in a way where people just have to log on and there's a feed, and that feed is going to tell them the things that they want to know based on things they've interacted with or, other videos that they've watched or things like that. It's all very carefully put together. So I thought this was a bit interesting that really they go on there because of the convenience of what it delivers to them versus the knowledge of getting the most accurate information possible. So that's something that really, I think, should be given some thought to, because to me, I don't know, maybe, but I thought that was a pretty interesting point, that it was really more about the convenience than it was about the accurate information, which is probably more troublesome, right? Because there is a lot of misinformation, there is a lot of inaccurate information. And if they're going on there for convenience and not really worried about the accuracy of said information they're getting, that could really lend itself to be a bigger problem.
Here's a question for your opinion. Board members sharing on their own pages the official school district information as it's getting out, helpful, or stay disciplined to let people go to one source as opposed to coming to your source to get from the official source?
To me, I think if it's information that's already been released by the district and they're just sharing district information, I don't see why that would be a bad thing. I think if they are taking that information and offering further information outside of what's been put on there, that's a problem. And the understanding that you are never not a board member. As much as you want to eliminate or not eliminate, separate yourself as a community resident and a board member, it'll never happen.
Yeah, before this webinar, we had a legal webinar talking about using your personal social media pages for official school district business, how it could then become a quasi-official site, and you could find yourself in legal trouble with trying to edit comments and whatever. So stay away from it. Let the school district do their job.
Correct. So if you're sharing something that they've already put out there and you're just want to basically pass along information that's already been provided, as a means to just make a broader channel, maybe you're friends with other people and they didn't see the school, whatever it is, fine. Don't offer your own opinion. Don't offer any further information. Don't comment on something. Don't go inside of the parents' pages and comment. It doesn't
stick to your protocol.
It doesn't help you,
right.
And you are never going to separate the two. Right.
And hopefully you've established a communications protocol for this ahead of time and you're not trying to develop it on the fly, and the board members are aware of what their role is and what the protocol is.
And this slide really, that slide that we just had up really doesn't have to be talked about much, but I think it sort of does lend itself to the prior slide of, recognizing that the inaccuracy is what they dislike the most, but the convenience still drives them there. And then here, we just have the news outlets to social medias for several types of, bits of information. So, I just thought that these sort of were good in terms of having us giving a little bit of awareness to social media as a whole, how social media is maybe consumed, especially during a crisis, that, it does play into. It's really going to be the place where the first thing that's going to happen is a child is going to text their parent, and that parent is going to write inside of the mom's page, I just heard from Johnny and he said XYZ.
Yep.
And there it goes. So that doesn't
mean off to the races.
Most accurate information. That doesn't mean that the mom didn't understand something differently. That doesn't mean, or the dad, there are so many things that can happen, but that is typically the way things unfold. The student gets to the parent goes directly to the mom's page and wants to understand, did anybody else hear this? Is anybody else hearing from their kid? And so on.
I think this is going to be a very important aspect, the recovery. When I saw this slide deck and I saw this section, I was like, yes, this is a part that sometimes gets overlooked.
Yes. And, I think it's probably one that we don't really think about, right? You're dealing with prior to the crisis itself, but then you have the aftermath of the crisis and the reflection and the review. And, how do these things really impact you moving forward? How do they impact the community? How do they impact the school district itself? How do they impact those that are showing up every day for work, for school? and depending on the situation, that's going to really dictate what the recovery looks like. So you can probably move on to the next. But I think, first and foremost is that support for your students and staff, and maybe even your parents, because depending on what the tragedy is, it really could sort of lend itself to hitting a lot of people that you weren't necessarily prepared for. People that maybe don't have access to that support by themselves, maybe don't want to ask for that support, but if it's just there and it's given to them, they would. So, that is something you have to really give a fair amount of thinking to. And it's not just in the moment, right? It's not just while that's happening, it's the after, when everything phases out and the dust settles and you're left with just, whatever's happened. And, does this affect a building where we can't open it again? Does this affect the entire district? Do we have displaced students? Do we have, all those sorts of things that you won't really know until it's sort of all said and done. And then you move into this phase of the crisis with how do we manage moving forward? And what does that new space potentially, what does that same space look like? Are we using the same building? Is there just a section of the building we can't use? Do all these students who were in this building have to go to a different building now? And we've had situations where, we had the Superstorm Sandy, where, we've had a building where they were displaced and couldn't use it for, I don't even remember how long, maybe years. And those students, it does affect them. And maybe that wasn't a crisis like having, Sandy Hook went through, but you still have displaced students and displaced teachers and staff, and that does affect how they move through their day and what their classroom was and now is. So you have to go back to that empathy as well in your recovery, creating, reflecting on the crisis itself. What are the things we could have done better? What are the questions we still have to answer? We've talked about the rumor control, updated messaging. Predict and prepare is, probably the hardest. We can predict a lot of things and prepare for a lot of things, but I think in my last slide, maybe I say nothing will ever go as planned. So you can do the best you can, but, understand too that for the type A person specifically, there's just going to be a lot of gray. There's not a lot of black and white inside of a crisis communication scenario, or a crisis itself, I should say, not even communication. There's going to be a lot of gray areas. There's going to be a lot of on the fly thinking. There's going to be a lot of, I didn't prepare for this, so what am I going to do now? You have to be very quick and very, very thoughtful in that quick approach. And two, I think, the normalizing of expected reactions to trauma, everybody's different. And, I think most often everybody goes through some kind of trauma training or the mental health and all those things. But I don't know that, you can really sort of understand that until you're in that, until you've really had a full understanding of, and that knowledge that what affects one person one way is not going to be how everybody feels. And so you have to have that sort of understanding that not everyone is going to deal with, and some might be extremely irrational from where you think they should be. And you have to understand that that might just be their coping mechanism. That might just be how they're handling it. And that's okay. And we will work through that. And involving your stakeholders, and that's probably well after the fact, but you might want to invite them in to, sort of even get their feedback on how things went, because the only thing we can do is learn from and move forward and reevaluate. And so some of the things, that we really want to just go over again, that we've touched upon, and these are just, some of the key things or the key elements that we talked about throughout this whole entire presentation. Again, having that clarity and the consistency with not only our messaging, with our words, with the way we're acting, our behaviors, things we're doing. Timeliness and accessibility is extremely important too. If you're kind of goes back to that avoidance thing, if you're just avoiding everything because you don't have the means to deal, then put somebody else on it. Because it's not going to do any good if people cannot, have access to you, or they can't ask you questions. To me, empathy to the entire situation is one of the biggest things that you can have. That understanding that not everybody is going to handle it the same, and you have to understand that. That engagement we just talked about, the reviewing of how we handle things, what we're going to do moving forward. But I think really the biggest thing on here is just there's nothing that will ever go as planned or expected. You can have every dialogue under the sun, every letter prepared, every T crossed, I dotted. It doesn't matter. You have to be able to adapt to a moving situation. You have to be able to move through things that are going on. You have to, because nothing. I have seen some of the same situations almost to a T, that the same event that happened, different school districts, different communities, completely opposite. So
Okay.
just have that awareness that there is no one issue that can be handled exactly as you would expect.
But like everything else, you try to plan and prepare, have a protocol in place, make sure all the key players are aware of the protocol, right? I mean, my key takeaways tonight were, you know, be disciplined as a governance team, who's speaking, what information's going out, who is coordinating the logistics A through Z. Everybody stay in their lane, be patient, accuracy over expediency, right? And again, it's the after recovery, right? The recovery of how you continue to communicate the message of we got through this together, and being empathetic, and we're here and everything else. So, plan and as a board, make sure, your governance team is in sync with what the protocols are, and don't wait until something happens to develop something on the fly. Those are the key takeaways you've taught me tonight, and those are very hard to do. The navigating the emotion, I think, is very, very difficult depending on the circumstance, because the crisis could be weather related, like you said. It could be really tragic, like a Sandy Hook situation or the passing of a popular student. It could be an external crisis. We saw this after October 7th, right? With what happened over in Israel, there were different things that developed in school communities, and it was different in how you handled that from a communication and engaging your stakeholders. You have to know your groups, and you have to know your community and how to communicate that. So those have been the key takeaways for me tonight, Corinne, and I really appreciate you going through and sharing your expertise with us, and kind of tips as well as you go through. And folks, if you got questions, reach out to Syntax and Corinne, and see, you know, maybe you have a PR person on staff, maybe you have an external firm, maybe you're a small district and you have a team of people that kind of work on it with your social media platform. Just make sure you have a plan in place, I think, is the biggest thing, and work through it. Kind of test it out, and see how it goes, and see how it plays out. I don't know how you test it out, but at least review it, and don't let it sit on the shelf for too long, because things change. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up this evening, Corinne?
No, I just, again, thank you for having me tonight. And, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate being able to do this for everybody who is tuned in and who will check it out on demand after. So thank you.
Yep. And this slide deck will be on our website in the next couple of days as well. So there will be a PowerPoint. And we appreciate you tuning in. And again, everybody will get an opportunity to see this on demand. So if you jumped in and jumped out, we're going to have it out there. You'll get a link for it. And Corinne, we really appreciate you taking the time out and really sharing your years of expert advice with us. And it's one of those things that you hope you never have to encounter, but anybody that's been in this business long enough knows that sooner or later we're all going to experience something of a crisis level. And hopefully we keep cool heads, consistent messaging, and then we're there for our community and our students and our staff afterwards. So a lot of great comments are coming in here on the chat. I don't know if you could see it, but
Yeah, I
they
can.
they they enjoyed you much more than me, which is great. That's the way it should be. And again, we're going to be sending out a brief survey to all those that attended live so that you can give us your feedback and, more importantly, give us some suggestions as to future webinars that you would like to have brought to you. And we'll bring in experts just like Corinne. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, have a great night, and we'll chat soon. And the good news is the One House budgets are out. There's encouraging information as far as restoration of cuts. It's not the final step, but advocacy works because a lot